Welcome back to Advancing Cyber Podcast Origin Story Series. Happy to continue the conversation with Katie Moussouris, founder and CEO of Luta Security. This is part 2 of her origin stories discussion. So if you haven't heard part 1 yet, I highly recommend going back to give it a listen. There's a lot of cyber ahead. So please enjoy part 2 of Advancing Cyber Origin Stories with Katie Moussouris. Thanks. I think that is an amazing place to end that part of the conversation, because I want to shift gears to talk about what I love to call my least favorite Jason Bourne movie, the Wassenaar Arrangement. And for those of you who haven't had the pleasure of seeing that film quite yet, legally speaking, the Wassenaar Arrangement is a 42-country export control regime. This is not on Netflix. It was set up in 1996 in order to create rules of the road, and they say transparency. I think we'll challenge that in a minute. When there is a transfer of conventional arms, think guns, weapons, tanks, and what are called dual-use goods. That means that if you have something that you can use as a weapon or a military armament, but it's also in use in your day-to-day life. So like if you've got a pencil you use to do work in a nuclear silo, that could be a dual-use good. So it's the rules of the road when you're transferring these conventional arms or dual-use goods from country A to country B. And back in 2012, a few countries decided that it was too hard to regulate the early days of the commercial spyware industry directly in their own countries and within their own borders. So they decided that it would be better to start to treat this as an export control issue. And they decided to use the export control subgroups in the Wassenaar Arrangement, and that are under the direction of the Department of Commerce, to help figure that out. Much of that work is done in classified spaces. It's very hard to figure out because it is so technical. It is the sort of stuff that lawyers and technologists can even glaze over a little bit, because you really have to be fluent in export control to figure out what people are talking about. And a regulation got passed through the export control space that said that software that had the ability to modify an intended path of its process would have to be regulated through this Wassenaar process and needed a license. And it was so overbroad that it was going to impact just exponentially more software than the Department of Commerce intended. Unfortunately, at the time, the Wassenaar had never, ever rolled back a control. And I remember a certain Katie Moussouris and a certain Cristin Flynn Goodwin had never been told, never before. And so a whole bunch of us got involved. How did you get into this? Because I think you had already left Microsoft by this time, and, deciding to join the quest of this Jason Bourne movie was not something undertaken lightly, because it was a heck of a lift. How did you decide to join this particular fight?
That is a great question, one that I asked myself over and over again as I found myself embroiled in this at the time. So what I recall was I was hearing from all sectors that we deal with. I was hearing from vendors of software. I was hearing from researchers. I was hearing from, a lot of different sections. And when they all agree that this thing was messed up, I was like, ooh, this thing's pretty messed up. Normally these two sides of regulated parties don't usually agree, but the fact that we were all in agreement and the overbroad unintended consequences, the dragnet that this thing set up, was going to be a big problem. And in a lot of cases, it was going to catch or try to control routine pieces of software, not just, dual use, but much more routine things. And it was also going to impede defense. And so I think from my perspective, I looked at it as, look, I am doing vulnerability disclosure. I am encouraging organizations to do this. This will impede vulnerability disclosure. This will also impede incident response. And so what ultimately happened was there were a series of meetings where I came and presented a few different ways the fact that, one, I understood what they were regulating. Because I think in the early days, they thought that we misunderstood. We, the researcher community, or we, the vendor community, whoever we were, they said, you know what, you don't understand. We're not regulating 0 days. We're not regulating vulnerability reports. We're not regulating any of that stuff. We're just regulating intrusion software and intrusion software technology. Just why won't you get it? And we were like, no, we know what you're regulating. And here's the thing. So I remember drawing on the board inside the Department of Commerce during one of these meetings for the council that I now sit on, by the way, but it was one of the ISTAC, council meetings that I was invited to present at. And I basically drew sort of like a bullseye. I said, this is the 0 day, the vulnerability itself. You're not regulating this. This is the exploit that is a piece of software that exploits that hole, that is in the software. You're not regulating that either. You're regulating the ability to create that exploit that exploits the software. You're regulating this. And they were like, oh, she does get it. Oh, okay. I guess we'll listen to her then, right? And I just remember first having to establish the fact that I know exactly what you're regulating by this language, even though I am a non-native speaker of Wassenaar and export controls. I have learned enough to translate what you're doing here, and what you're doing is a problem. And so once I kind of established that, it was really a matter of, essentially proving the case that this was going to harm defense, it was going to harm vulnerability disclosure, and it was going to harm incident response. And I remember, after having done a lot of these sort of giving advice, not just to the United States, but anytime I was in another country, I would request a meeting with that country's export control folks. So I had gone to Australia, I had gone to the UK, I had gone to, a few of the Netherlands, a few of these other places, and just started talking through that same bullseye diagram and why it was a problem. So by the time I was asked to be part of the Wassenaar arrangement delegation that was led by the State Department, I had just started my own company, and it was kind of the worst time ever to be like, yeah, I'm just going to take a week off from growing my brand new month-and-a-half-old company, and I'm just going to go help directly renegotiate, these export controls for fun in Vienna right now. So I did that, though, because I knew how important it was. And, I wasn't the only technical person that they brought with to help explain this. We had also, our friend from VMware who also came along as well. But really, it was, so first exercise was convince the United States to reconsider. And then we had to convince 40 plus other countries to reconsider, because it has to be unanimous at Wassenaar.
Yeah.
So that whole process end to end, of once I joined and was part of the delegation, that took another year and a half or so. Because these meetings are intermittent, and, you go and you make a little progress every time. But ultimately, I would say that we got the right outcomes. There's still more, to refine there, but we got the right outcomes, and that we got exemptions put into the definitions so that we could carve out vuln disclosure practices, and we could carve out incident response from export control requirements. Because who in the middle of a worm outbreak is going to take the time to fill out their own country's export control permission slip and send it off and get it reviewed and everything before sending a sample of a command and control piece of software to a colleague in another country in the middle of a global worm, outbreak?
Right.
And that was one of
you can't bring in that researcher from another country who's the best in the world on it, because you don't have an export control license to loop them in. That's right.
Right. And you don't know where different samples of this controlled software are going to pop up in the world. So you can't prearrange it. You can't, get the licenses ahead of time. So there are all these practical reasons why it was important to involve the broader community in these discussions. But I would say that had I had the chance to do it all over again, I don't know. I think I probably would have written up my comments, maybe not traveled so much during the early part of trying to grow a startup. But ultimately, we did get the outcome that we needed from that, at least in carving out those exemptions.
But it's shocking when you reflect on it, because it took 4 years. While you were leading the technical charge, I remember leading on the policy and political front. I had to get a coalition, the Responsible Cybersecurity Coalition, together. Mm-hmm. I remember testifying on the Hill. I remember traveling to all the countries too, doing the same thing that you were doing, but meeting with the legal and policy folks, because in Europe, when you're getting an export control license, it's not transparent. So you'll go to the export control authority, you'll get your license and nobody knows about it. So it's this mother may I secret thing that makes it really hard for other companies or the rest of the world to know what the standards are. And I remember getting 156 members, sort of evenly split, D's and R's, to join a letter to the White House to try to get, really, it was a mix of commerce and state, to agree to reopen the issue at Wassenaar. And when you think about the importance of cybersecurity and the nuances that we deal with all the time, it still really bothers me that our industry could end up being regulated in export control. And but for a few people willing to volunteer in these groups like the ISTAC, where you are, it is something that will fly by most people who will never know about it. And for people in small and medium-sized companies, you'll never know. Because if you don't have a mega corporation or someone like you who is simply a humanitarian and generous to donate your time, how would you ever know that these things are happening? I mean, it is the least transparent way to regulate technology that I can think of. So, and rant, but we still haven't solved the spyware problem, because spyware is not being developed by large corporations applying for export control licenses in a significant way. So what do we do?
No, that is a great question. And there is an ongoing process that is co-led by the UK and France, by the UK and French governments, called the Pall Mall process. And right now it's been going through, a few iterations, and it's attempting to get states to agree on the parameters by which they will use these kinds of spyware software. It's not necessarily focusing on the exporting of them that Wassenaar was, but it's really about the fact that everyone's saying, yep, we've got these weapons, we're going to use them. Let's all have some gentle person's agreements on, the fair ways that we should be using these things and what governing principles we're going to have here. And it's still in very early stages, but I think that, they are, to the Pall Mall process folks' credit, they are actually inviting more parties to this stage of the conversation than what we saw in the Wassenaar stuff. And I don't think the folks behind the Wassenaar original, additions to the Wassenaar that caused us all such heartburn, they didn't mean to exclude, parties that could be helpful. They just thought they had it all in hand. And I remember one person saying early on, who was part of that process, saying, look, I know you folks don't want us to regulate software because you think, that we can't, but we have. And they pointed to the what the hackers refer to as the crypto wars as a good example of how that all worked out fine. And we were like, oh, it took a long time for that to work out to almost okay. And you realize how much damage banning, cryptographic algorithms above a certain strength actually had on the security of the internet. No, you don't realize it because you didn't have to do the cleanup in the aftermath. But, there was a time in the early 2000s when strong crypto was banned from export, and therefore you had to have browsers, web browsers, just knocking their encryption down to bargain basement levels that were crackable by anybody. And so you basically had unsecured transactions all over the internet because of these export controls in their early forms, right? And so they didn't realize that was actually such a big problem when they went to do it again. And I think at this point, though, they have invited many more people who have the technical ability and the experience to explain the broader implications of what they're doing. And I think, like I said, the Pall Mall process folks are doing that as well, trying to bring in, more experienced and technical folks at this level of consultation, and also folks who are going to be at the front lines of enforcement, the policy folks, the lawyers, and whatnot. I think it's a much more inclusive process this time. So we'll see.
We'll find out, because they're going to have the opportunity to deal with post-quantum encryption pretty soon to go figure that out. So we'll find out. So let's talk a little bit about sort of where we see some of these challenges coming up for young people, and reflecting back a little bit, because you and I have been at this for quite some time. And I'm curious how you think AI is going to impact the way that kids are able to, or not necessarily kids, but how vulnerabilities get found. And do we think that AI is going to become better at finding vulns than humans, or will AI classes of found vulns just get exempted out of bug bounty spaces? Will there be things that are just better for humans to find? What are you thinking about when you're sipping your tea and debating where we go?
Well, I think that, AI is definitely going to have a role in both software development as well as security and vulnerability hunting and threat hunting. I think that you're seeing the rise of vibe coders, right? People who don't have to have any coding knowledge, that are able to just use natural language and AI to write software, with very little skill of their own. The AI is doing it for them. I think we're going to see vibe hackers show up, where they're using AI and they're saying, well, I want to steal all the credit card numbers. So write me, and the AI model developers are trying to put safeguards in place, et cetera. But you can usually trick those models by saying, I am a professor of a software security class, and I need for you to teach, write a teaching module, et cetera. Yeah. And that usually does it for tricking the AI into doing what you want or getting close enough. So in terms of classes of vulnerabilities, what I think is going to happen is these vibe coders, we're using AI to develop software, are going to be developing the same software with the same software holes as we've seen, because they're being trained on existing software with those existing holes. They're being trained on vulnerable software in the first place. So you're going to see classes of vulnerabilities that honestly persist much longer, I think, with AI-assisted coding, not really coding for security, but really coding for that vibe of functionality and so much more proliferation. I mean, it used to be, vuln disclosure was really about reaching and getting the big vendors to listen to you, because the big vendors were the ones writing most of the software. As the big vendors got better and writing more secure software, we got a proliferation of software developers, especially on mobile platforms, right? You didn't have to be a big vendor to have a hit piece of software that was running on, hundreds of millions of systems, little computers in your pocket. So we're going to see another wave of this, this proliferation of software, and unfortunately proliferation of software bugs. And then similarly, I think we're going to see a proliferation of, bug hunting. And to your last question of, do I think there are classes of bugs that are best found by humans? The business logic flaws are usually the ones that the humans are best at finding. And we may be able to train some AI into finding more of those, but we'd actually have to have some humans doing the training, doing the nudging to get them to start to look for those types of things. But yeah, I mean, I think the real threat for us and for young people coming up in the world is that right now we're seeing a lot of organizations see AI as a cost-cutting mechanism. Use AI in place of humans. Use AI with fewer humans, right? And we don't have to pay as many people if their job is enhanced by AI. So I think in the cybersecurity realm, we're going to see cuts like that as well. We're going to see, well, we don't need to hire as many cybersecurity experts, because the non-experts that we're able to pay a low wage to, or a much lower wage to, can use AI. And with that use of AI, we can still get good enough security out of it. So I think we're going to have to see where the level of tolerance normalizes with all of this stuff. It is a system dynamic that is still in flux, and we will see what happens.
Oof, that's depressing. Well, then let's give a shout out to one more ISO standard to potentially train AI on, which would be 27034, the security development lifecycle, and helping AI actually learn how to write software more securely towards a direction of software assurance. Because if we end up in a place where companies are not investing in writing secure code, gosh, I hope we can train AI to do that. That would be amazing. That would be tremendous. But
if it goes as well as me trying to edit a selfie to look more professional as a headshot, it's not going to go well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
I did have this experience recently where I said, oh, this is a pretty good picture. I could use it as a headshot, but it's very obviously a selfie. So I asked the AI to just move my arm position from selfie position to down at my side. You'd think this would be okay. It did everything but what I wanted. It blurred that part. It tried cutting it out, and there was a giant white rectangle there. So I think we may see some, mishaps in the training of AI to write more secure code. They might just cut the feature, be like, more secure, feature doesn't exist anymore. Or, do some mangled version of input filtration or input validation or output filtration to try to mitigate injection attacks. I think we're going to still see some pretty clumsy looking end photos, with this process, but hopefully it'll get better. We're nowhere near where we were even just a couple of years ago in terms of what AI advancements have come. So I'm hoping the next few years of additional iteration and advancement, will prove me wrong, and it'll be wonderful. And we'll have a world of classes of vulnerabilities removed automatically by AI.
Yeah. If it can make me look 20 years younger, I love it. And I'm still sticking with my moisturizer. So if you think about learning opportunities for young people, one of the things that always amazed me in the researcher and hacker and more technical side of our profession was that there were so many conferences and so many opportunities to engage and learn and showcase and network. But I don't know, I guess as lawyers, we just don't want to talk to each other that much. How do you decide where to invest your time and where to choose wisely? And as you're seeing younger people, how do you coach them on where to go as they start to build their networks?
Well, building networks and building skills may look different for different people. When I was growing up online in the very early stages of the internet, the fact that anybody online at the time was going to be a little bit, sort of in the nerd category, in the technical category, and you would automatically, be able to network and learn from and learn with and teach a group of your online peers, and that was how early hacking groups came about, some of whom I've been associated with in the past, et cetera. But young people today, really have a lot of options. They also have unfortunately, a lot of scams that are out there trying to sell them boot camps and say, subscribe to my newsletter and take my course and I'll get you a 6-figure paying job in, X number of weeks. So I think that young people need to be careful in terms of where they seek their knowledge, their education, and their networking opportunities. And I still think that there's a place for conferences, for sure. And conferences have gotten better at creating and enforcing codes of conduct so that younger, especially non-male participants can feel safer at conferences when they actually physically go. But I would say, we have a long way to go in terms of having sort of the perfect idealized environment in which to learn, in which to grow your skills, in which to network and find work opportunities, learning opportunities. But I do say that for people who want to get involved in more technical areas, that doing capture the flags is actually a great way to get started. It's a safe environment, and you can learn both defense and attack in a capture the flag environment. There are labs set up for you to do that. If you want to get paid while learning, you could try doing bug bounties. But what I advise people at is just look at it as, something that you may or may not get paid for your work. So just be prepared that this is going to be something that is speculative labor. So if you go into it expecting or demanding to be paid, you're probably not going to have a great time. And then I would say in terms of networking, smaller conferences, more localized conferences are the best places because then you get introduced to people in your area that you can follow up with. There's been a proliferation of B-sides conferences that are city and region specific and they're independently run. They're smaller and they have more of that like early hacker conference vibe to them. Even B-sides Las Vegas, which is one of the biggest B-sides conferences there is, still keeps a small, relatively small footprint. and that old hacker vibe. I would say that for technical folks who want to get more into policy and get more into influencing policy or lawmaking when it comes to cybersecurity, that, there are a number of different ways that you can start interacting with people on that side. And the biggest piece of advice that I have is no matter what you decide to do, come at it with curiosity, because if you are curious as to what their goals are, you might be able to help them reach their goals, maybe not in the thing that they wrote in the first place, but maybe in some variation of that. And the thing, I like to say is hackers going to hack, vendors going to vend, and regulators going to regulate. And you really can't stop any of these parties from doing what they're going to do. If you want to cross over between these groups and help influence them all, you really do have to try to understand their perspective and not come in with your own perspective saying, you're wrong, I'm right, and this is how you should be doing, or you just shouldn't do what you're doing at all, right? So each of those groups has something to learn from each other.
I love that, especially because for young lawyers, one of the things that I love is to go out into your community, into the hacking community, and go learn, because the law is what it is. But in order to shape it and refine it, you have to be technically credible. And if you're afraid of the technology and you're afraid of asking questions and being the least educated person in the room on something for a long time, you're not going to be able to advance the state of the art. So you've got to go and learn and ask those questions. So yeah, I completely agree. So if you are a lawyer or a policy person and you want to think about where the security law and policy is going to go in 20 or 25 years, go find those technologists, because where they're going is where you need to be. And so it's a match made in heaven. So you've done big tech, you've done medium tech, and now you're the CEO of your own company. So they're all very, very different. But which part of your own Eras tour have you grown the most from, or are you the most energized by?
It is such a great question. And every era had its purpose. Every era had its growth and its moments. Like, for example, I started out my career not as a hacker, because I am old enough that hackers didn't have a professional career path at the time I started working in technology. So I started working in technology as a scientist and then as a systems administrator, taking care of the computers of the Human Genome Project, and then moving on to becoming a Linux developer. So I was a software developer in the Unix world, and then moving into professional cybersecurity just at the birth of that particular, career path as a viable career path at all, and the professionalization of those services. But when I came to Microsoft, I had already had a pretty well-established career and a long career at that point. But it was Microsoft that taught me the complexity of scale. And for that experience, I couldn't have had that experience anywhere else at that time. Certainly, since then, there have been other companies that have grown to such massive scale. But at that time, 2007, when I joined Microsoft, they were the biggest software company in the world. They ran on well over 1 billion computer systems worldwide, which at the time was almost all of them, And there was no better place for me to learn the lessons of scale than when I worked at Microsoft. Similarly, working in academia, rewinding to earlier in my career, I got a taste of having to do it yourself, roll it yourself, explaining every single technical decision you ever made, and the trade-offs, and having to adapt to the fact that while it's possible that they want your data, it's more probable that they want your bandwidth. So they want your computing power and your bandwidth. So convincing, hires up that we needed better segmentation of our networks, or segmentation at all, back in the 90s was an uphill battle. Absolutely. Especially at an academic institution that wanted to be open. There was a no firewalls policy at MIT. That's how old I am. That
Wow.
they were literally forbidden. And so we had to roll our own, host-based defenses and detection systems and all of that stuff. So there was a great technical growth at the beginning of my career. Great growth in terms of scale and complexity and how to solve big problems that in a smaller organization, you could sort of snap your fingers and solve, but a large organization that affected the entire world, you had to have completely different worldview and a much, it was much more balanced and nuanced in that sense. I would say, when you were giving your advice to lawyers and policymakers of seeking out technologists, seek out technologists from different facets of that problem set. You want to seek out the ones that have to roll their own and can solve the problem on a much smaller scale because they're closer to the problem in a lot of ways. But you also need to seek out technologists who have dealt with this at scale. And that was something I would see missing, that nuance of knowing whose authoritative opinion should a lawmaker take and weigh more heavily in drafting a law, because they could have drafted something that'll work great for a Microsoft, horrible for a new business, right? Or vice versa, could be doable on a small scale, but would be absolutely not actionable at all for a large business to do. So having that balance in who you're getting your technological influence from really matters. And then this last era, which I wouldn't recommend to anyone, honestly, of running your own business, absolutely not. You have to be crazy. You are a fellow nut job in terms of
I am indeed
running your own business. But what it's taught me so many things. It's taught me a lot about the bootstrap versus VC world. It's taught me a lot about the fact that I have to run a business the way that, my grandpappy would have had to run a business, in that you have to be profitable or you die. Whereas VC-backed companies, some in my same space, are not only not profitable, they are actively just burning through much more money without generating a profit. And I dare say, even at points in our pasts, I've been running this company for 9 years, there were times when I was hitting their actual revenue, the same amount of revenue as some of these companies earlier on, but they had so much more cash to burn. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So just learning all of the dynamics of what is the measure of a successful business? What does success mean in terms of the broader ecosystem? Am I really helping customers is honestly my biggest measure of success. Do customers benefit from the knowledge and the expertise and the services that I've given them? And is that sustainable long-term as a business? I think I've learned, and I'm continuing to learn as the market evolves and changes. But I know that, before this era of heavy VC investment, a la, the Uber and Lyft kind of, price everybody else out of the marketplace by making your service offerings bargain basement cheap.
Yeah.
But get market share, but get this insane growth of market share. That style of creating business is relatively new. We did not have that, in the early part of the internet even. So that, I think, is going to be something that will shape the dynamics of the technology and the services that we have to choose from as consumers and users of products and services going forward. It's not necessarily going to be the best. It's not necessarily going to be the solution that gets you the most bang for your buck. It's going to be something that successfully, marketed itself with the right price point and you decided to go with it and whatnot. So I think one controversial thing that I've said in the past is that I think that if organizations grow too fast to be able to secure and keep private the data that they're stewards of, I think that it's not the organization, the small business, that should suffer. I think it's their VC backers. I think they should be fined. So in terms of software liability, I'm more like, it should be VC liability. They're the ones who push for that growth, going well over their skis. And I had found a vulnerability in Clubhouse, the social media voice chat app, where I tried to report it. They had a bug bounty program. It was private. And, I ended up talking to one of the founders, found out they were a smaller company at the time than my company. And they hadn't built out any processes for writing secure code or handling vulnerabilities. They just slapped a bug bounty on that thing and said, we'll just put them, put finders in a private bug bounty and pay them for silence. And we can just, kind of keep this monumental growth. They were around 10 million users at that point in time. They had a $4 billion valuation. So, who should be responsible for that? Not the, 5 or 6 person startup that they actually were at the time, but really they're VCs that were pushing them to grow so fast, well beyond their ability to care for, be proper stewards of their data and their users. So I don't know. I think I answered your question in a series of, these were all my learnings from these different eras, but the one that I would say, has brought me the most joy has been the most joy, the most sorrow, the most pain, the most opportunities to keep growing is my own company.
That's awesome. And I love the fact that you're teeing up the next era of changing the future. So that's pretty cool. So you've been in cyber for over 25 years. You are already a queen. I've known you for a very long time. But if you could, what would you like to change in our industry that would benefit the world?
Well, if I could go back in time, but I can't, but even if we started now, I would say we need to focus on outcomes. We've been focusing on practices and, that's natural, right? The industry has been growing and refining what best practices should be. Remember when best practice used to be, rotate your passwords every 3 months? Well, that turns out that's actually, not as good as making strong, complex, long passwords of a certain length, right? And keeping them in a password manager and using unique passwords. Like those are all the refinements of best practices, right? But what we haven't done is we haven't really concentrated on measuring outcomes. We know that in secure development, you can perform a series of activities that are noted as best practices, but the order in which you do them, how close to the, final release date of your software that you do them, to give yourself time to remediate anything you fix, all of those details matter. And we're just using it as sort of check boxes of like, did I do this thing that's a security best practice, yes or no? And we're not measuring the outcomes. We're also not really great at measuring maturity as it changes over time. Organizations are like civilizations. They rise and fall in terms of their ability to handle the problems that are in front of them. There are golden eras where someone who is very motivated creates a team that's very motivated, and you've got this pretty high level of security, maturity, and functionality. And then those team members leave, and unless you've, really prioritized making that process well documented and robust, you end up losing it as those people leave the organization. And then you end up having to, learn how to write again on clay tablets, And so if I were to change something about our industry, I would say, look, we've got to start focusing on measurable outcomes, and we've got to start measuring our maturity, understanding that it will fluctuate, and ways to, essentially shore up our own infrastructure as we go and as we grow and our threats change. And that's something we viewed things as too static for too long.
I love that. So any final thoughts on where you see vulnerability disclosure moving over the next 5 years? Bring us, look out over the horizon. Where do you see us heading?
I hope that we end up in a place where people realize that they need to do that dental hygiene of security and have the processes in place. I also hope that we get back to the fundamental truth that vulnerability disclosure is really just about having a way for people to tell you about the bugs you missed. You should have, the bugs in a vuln disclosure program or a bug bounty program. Those are all symptoms of underlying security process failures. They are things that you missed in your secure development lifecycle. They are things you missed in your infrastructure deployments. So when we get to a place where, let's say it's vuln disclosure nirvana and everybody's got a process to handle incoming vuln reports, everybody's got a really easy mechanism to report security holes to organizations, and we're in this nirvana. Well, what are they using those bugs to teach them? What are they doing instead of playing whack-a-bug with each individual bug? How are they taking that information and using it to improve the process that led to that bug in the first place? So that I would love to see that be the evolution. It's not going to happen in the next 5 years. We'd be lucky if we get organizations just doing the process part right. But that's why this has been my lifelong work for very many years, and certainly the entire time you and I have known each other.
I love it. And hopefully for younger people listening, they can pick up the mantle from you on the vuln disclosure side and me on the legal side and keep it going, because there's a lot more work to do. So Katie, thank you so much. And thank you to everybody for listening to the Advancing Cyber podcast Origin Story series. We hope you enjoyed the discussion and that we've advanced cyber along the way. I want to thank our guest, Katie Moussouris, and our Advancing Cyber team with management support from DC Cyber Communications and research assistant, Layla Moeller. Thanks, everybody, and keep patching your systems. And remember, we're all a part of the security community. Thanks.
Thank you so much.